Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Instead of de-escalation in Ukraine, the war of words and increased tensions on the ground continue to see a showdown of some kind. This is pitting Washington against Moscow. Is this artificially induced crisis in Ukraine turning into a defining historical moment? To crosstalk the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, I'm joined by my guest, Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He is the editor of Politics First magazine. Also in London, we have Patrick Henningsen. He is a journalist, writer, and founder of the news website 21stCenturyWire.com. And in Cleveland, we cross to Vladimir Suchan. He is a professor and former Czechoslovak diplomat. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules. In fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want. Marcus, if I go to you first in London, not only are tensions growing on the ground in Ukraine, but where the media war is heating up too. So let me see what we've got. We've got a fake anti-Semitic pamphlet, and just recently we have a few odd-looking pictures coming from out of eastern Ukraine with men wearing funny hats and very strange beards, which, if I remember correctly, they did this trick in 2008 in South Ossetia. So is this all they've got? Because, my goodness, the NSA spends tens of billions of dollars every year, and this is their evidence of machinations coming from Russia in Ukraine.
Well, Peter, the conduct of Western media, be it American media, be it French media, be it British media, over the situation in Ukraine has been deplorable. It's been disgraceful, but it's not surprising. We saw this sort of conduct in the former Yugoslavia. We saw this in the run-up to Iraq. We saw this in Libya. We're seeing this in Syria, and we've seen it again in Ukraine. The fact that a bogus anti-Semitic story emerged recently in Ukraine and was picked up by all the main media outlets in the West and was presented as being genuine without any journalists having investigated it in a credible way is really intolerable. And it's a dangerous situation because Ukraine, it's a complex country. It's not a black and white matter what's happening there. And of course, politicians in Western capitals, they don't understand that. And that's one thing. But the fact that Western journalists are pouring into Ukraine, a country that prior to the conflict, they probably had never heard of before, yep. And they are giving credence to anything that Kiev says, to anything that pro-Maidan forces are saying in the east of the country is really unacceptable, and it's worrying because it's making the situation worse and worse. And of course, what we need is a peaceful resolution to the conflict in Ukraine.
Okay, Marcus, it seems to me, I agree with you, Marcus, but it seems to me that the West doesn't want that. They're doing everything in their power so that doesn't happen. Right. Vladimir, if I can go to you in Cleveland, look, Russia has proposed some ideas how to de-escalate it, but it's not being listened to whatsoever in Western capitals at all. And as I pointed out here, if we look at the de-escalation from last week, it looks like Washington just wants its own interpretation of this, following the lead of an illegal government in Kiev. There's very little evidence of that being reported in Western media. This is very dangerous.
Well, I would like to say that the word de-escalation that was embraced during the Geneva negotiations and agreement is an Orwellian euphemism that is deployed to cover up the exact opposite. Because it's evident that after the CIA director John Brennan's visit to Kiev on April the 12th, the Kiev junta embarked on a large-scale suppression of the popular uprising against the junta and fascism and the oligarchs in Ukraine. And that's what is going on. And at the same time, NATO announced various steps of further escalation of tensions, moving troops to Poland, to the Baltics, etc. So the talk about the escalation is actually concealing or covering political concrete steps on the ground that go in the very opposite direction. Going back to the leaflet hoax, I would like to add the following to it. A friend of mine from Norway already alerted me to the story about the would-be anti-Semitic leaflets in Norway being widely publicized the night before the Geneva negotiations last Thursday, where it became already big news. And it was clear that it was false, it was fake, and clearly it would probably take someone just a few minutes to photocopy or write some stupid leaflet like this. But then, after the negotiations were concluded, John Kerry very cleverly decided to have a separate press conference so that Lavrov could not respond to the wild accusations which were meant to sell this spy operation, where he lent his voice, his authority to the host of these anti-Semitic leaflets and playing this in a big way for the global media. And of course, right away, it became a big story, and all the major news outlets and media started publishing the story about the would-be anti-Semitism of anti-fascists. The last time I checked, anti-fascism was not anti-Semitic, and so it's like trying to turn the victim into the perpetrator, or to accuse the victim
if I could
of
go
the
to
very
Patrick,
things
let me go to
which
Patrick
one
in
is
London.
doing.
It's very interesting here because there is anti-Semitism in Ukraine, and it's in Kiev, and it's a belief held by members of that illegal government. But I suppose you didn't read that in the New York Times.
Yeah, you know, they're basically on incredible spin mode. And the biggest problem we have now in the 21st century is we have political class now that's basically groping on old ideologies and old themes, 20th century themes, because they don't have any sort of foundation in which to operate a situation like you have in Ukraine now in the 21st century. So what we see is just echoes and shadows of the past. The anti-Semitism card is, in my opinion, it was a cheap prank. And I believe John Kerry should resign after making that speech, because how could the top U.S. diplomat make such a definitive international speech on something in which there was no evidence as to the provenance of that flyer? So it's very embarrassing for the United States. But the biggest problem we have, and what you alluded to before, is the media war, the propaganda war, is that a very large percentage of the Western media outlets that reported on the anti-Semitic flyers did not issue equal retractions
as usual.
to the initial reports on it.
As usual.
That's a problem.
But
That's
Marcus,
a huge problem.
I'd like to go back to you in London. It's, you know, I said before earlier in the program is that the West doesn't want a solution to the biggest the tensions in Ukraine. Russia has offered some ideas, federalization, decentralization. These are all very reasonable ideas, and they would work. But the junta doesn't want that in Kiev. And who's leading this? Is it really the U.S. pushing this, or is it they just following what Kiev wants? Is it wag the dog? What is it?
Well, without a doubt, the illegitimate authorities in Kiev, and let me emphasise illegitimate because they are illegitimate, no one's voted them in, they're puppets. If you're really going to resolve the situation in the Ukraine, you've got to have the American government on board, and they must commit to what Russia's offers have been, very reasonable, for Ukraine not to join NATO, for Ukraine not to join the EU, and for Ukraine to adopt federalisation. These are very reasonable offers. But then again, the American government are not into reasonable compromise. America is all about safeguarding Pax Americana. And of course, Russia today is not the Russia of the 1990s. It's a resurgent Russia, and it is pursuing its foreign policy objectives. And America is very aware of that. And if you look at a map of Europe, all of Russia's western borders, apart from Ukraine in the south, are surrounded by EU and NATO member states. So America is not going to pull back. America needs Ukraine to complete the encirclement of Russia. But Peter, can I just very quickly say something about the people in Kiev? Yes, they're odious people, but no one should be surprised that the American government is using them and is not condemning them. Let's have a look. We can go back to Kosovo. Yep. The American government supported the Kosovan Liberation Army, which prior to the conflict had been listed by by the State Department as a terrorist organisation and as an organisation involved with organised crime. If we have a look in Libya, we're talking about Islamist forces which were utilised by the Americans to overthrow the legitimate government of Libya. If we have a look in Syria, we're talking about hardline Islamist forces which are being used by the Americans to overthrow the secular government of President Assad. So there should be no surprise that these repulsive people in Kiev, anti-Semitic, neo-Nazis, ultranationalists, are being used by the West. The West is not genuinely committed to democracy. If it was, it wouldn't have such a close relationship to Saudi Arabia. Let's have a look at Saudi Arabia, where a country where homosexuality is punishable by death, where apostasy is punishable by death, where women are deprived of the most rudimentary basic rights. Whenever an American politician says, we in America are committed to democracy, to refute that, all anyone has to say is, Saudi Arabia.
Okay, Vladimir, in Cleveland, I think that all of the examples that was just brought up there are very germane here. But the Ukraine is different because it borders Russia, and there are Russians and Russian speakers in Ukraine. And Russia is not going to be pushed around. Russia is not going to back down. I repeat, Russia is not going to back down here. Mr. Kerry, Mr. Biden, Ms. Nuland should realize that Russia is not going to back down. What's going to happen next?
So I think when we are talking about the media, it's important to realize one thing, how the media is supposed to work. And the way it is set up is taking clues from actually old political theory, is to control the narrative. And to some extent, we are all victims to the framing of the discourse, which then also limits and frames our ability to think or not to think. And which means that the media are largely trying to narrow what can be discussed and what is to be discussed, and that includes the diagnosis and also the solutions. And the media are going after thoughtless, emotional reactions. So in this respect, what we need to do is to step back and to establish a good, sound political diagnosis of what happened before we can talk about what could be good solutions.
Well, that's what we're trying to do on this program. Okay, gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Ukraine. Stay with RT. Okay, I'd like to go back to Patrick in London. It seems patently obvious to me, Patrick, that the West is escalating the situation in Ukraine. What do they hope to achieve? Do they want to provoke Russia into some kind of military action? Because I seriously doubt Russia will do that. Only if ethnic cleansing is committed in the East and the South, then it would be a right to protect operation. And Russia would not care whatsoever what Western media has to say about it. But I don't think it's going to get there because we have so many Ukrainian soldiers just giving up their arms and actually joining protesters in the East. So what does the West want? Because it looks like they have their goal, but it doesn't seem like they have the pieces on the ground to achieve their goal.
Well, we have two shows. We have the show on the surface, which is the media show. It's the Western propaganda show. And then we have the agenda under the surface. What's on the surface is really enabled by, during the Cold War, the idea of the Russian threat that was heavily promoted in U.S. culture and education for many generations. So they had a lot of easy traction to sort of restart that Russian threat. It exists in Americans' minds. And the administration in Washington right now is playing heavily on that. And below that is a military and arms agenda as well as an energy agenda. And I'll tell you who's driving this agenda. It's quite clear. It's companies like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, General Electric, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman. And some of these companies are also major shareholders and owners of every major U.S. broadcaster and media outlet. So it's no surprise that you're going to see this kind of tainted, twisted rhetoric coming from the media and not doing any investigation into any claims or any facts that are going on there, because the agenda, Peter, is to increase budgets for NATO and increase the U.S. Defense Department. Already Obama's wanting to increase nuclear arms spending above Cold War levels. So that should tell you what direction that the military-industrial complex wants to go in lieu of this crisis.
Marcus, it gets down to is that a new Cold War, a new policy of containment is good for business in America, and it may be. That's quite logical, what we heard from Patrick. But, you know, 100 years ago, almost exactly, August 1914, there was miscalculation. And I can guarantee you, I really want my viewers to understand, is that the Russian people are very much united about this issue. They have relatives in Ukraine. This is very, very close to them. This is not Libya. This is family. This is blood. This is tradition and culture. If Ms. Nuland wants to continue down this path, we're going to have a big problem, and I can guarantee you.
And of course, the big problem will have arisen because of ignorance of Ukraine, because of ignorance of the entire region. The way that Western journalists are referring to Russia and Ukraine, it's almost as if they're completely separate states historically. It's almost like Russia is an alien force in Ukraine. These journalists are completely ignorant that Russians, Ukrainians and Belarusians, they are the same people. They are East Slavs. They share the same state, the first state in their history, Kiev and Rus. They are tied to each other historically, culturally, linguistically, and also politically and economically. So there's no way that Russia will back off because, as you said, Russia and Ukraine are culturally tied to each other. There are millions of ethnic Russians in Ukraine, millions of Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Russia and Ukraine are joined at the hip, and that will always be the case. However, the way the West is portraying it is that that sort of relationship doesn't exist. And so the fact that Western journalists are covering it in that way and then reporting back to their respective countries, which is then being listened to by their politicians and their public, it doesn't bode well for the future.
Vladimir, it's very interesting here because from what Marcus just said, is that there's a historical misunderstanding here, because one of the interesting things that I've been told over and over again, that the Russian speakers and Russians in East Ukraine and South Ukraine, they're more like quote-unquote Soviet people because of the nuances of the Ukrainian identity. However, given what's going on in the last 6 months, that identity, that Russian identity, is actually on the upward surge.
Yeah, I think one of the underreported facts about the current Ukraine crisis is that many of the politicians tied to the junta, to the regime in Kiev, are openly calling for what can be seen as a call for a genocide, ethnic cleansing in South and Eastern Ukraine. Tymoshenko herself called those people to be Russians there in exile. And she called openly for mass killings of these people. Other oligarchs have already posted bounties on the heads, on the lives of these people, and the right sector is trying to terrorize or torture and kill people few at a time. However, in order to understand what is going on, as I said before, we need to step a little bit back, and we don't need to invent a wheel, but we can go to the sources of what is being unfolded in front of our eyes today. Here, I would like to recommend again, if I can, a book which I have not written. It was written by Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1997, The Grand Chessboard. And in that book, he openly says that the United States sees Central Europe largely as an American protectorate. And what happened in Ukraine in February is a consolidation and extension of this protectorate. According to Brzezinski, Ukraine is supposed to be a US-NATO bridgehead, clearly pointing toward Moscow. And if you look on the map, there are just about 400 miles between Kharkov and Moscow. So the plan is indeed to install a rapidly anti-Russian, pro-NATO regime in Kiev. Then you can put there some missiles, and the distance is just 400 miles. So then, if there is a conflict can be engineered. Then from the point of view of the US or NATO, it can be the message could be
okay,
the game is
Vladimir,
over.
you're saying the obvious here, and it's something that Western media doesn't want to talk about. Patrick, this is really has nothing to do with Ukraine. It's all about undermining Russia in its genuine security interests. That's what it's all about. It's always been that. Well, NATO expansion. I mean, even President Putin said that himself. He was very open about when we look at the situation, what was in Crimea. So that's really what it's about. It has nothing to do with democracy and human rights and self-determination, all those other wonderful things.
No, and you know, they're essentially pursuing a geopolitical, a philosophical agenda that it really comes from the 19th century British historian Halford Mackinder, and this is the theory of the heartland theory, that if you can control the heartland, and in this case we're talking about you know, Central Asia or Western Central Asia, then that would be in terms of geopolitical you know, achievements, that would be the big prize. And that is really what Germany was influenced by, was Mackinder's theory during the Second World War, and that caused so much violence and strife and caused many of the divisions that we see still today. That is an outdated theory, and believe it or not, you know, that is really driving, deep down, is driving a lot of the think tank policy thinking and projecting. The reality, Peter, is there are no good theories or ideologies anymore, because in the 19th century they could not have imagined the level of dynamicism and globalism and interconnectedness that we have in the 21st century. So we're having people running old software, essentially, to try to achieve things in the present day. That's why it's so dysfunctional, and that's why people as well are not really resonating with it, amazingly. Even with all the propaganda in America, a lot of people are just absolutely disengaged from this kind of adventurism by this administration.
Marcus, you know, I agree with almost everything that. Yeah, I was just going to say that I don't think the people in Washington and Brussels are that smart. I don't think they read those kinds of books. I don't think they know this kind of historical philosophy. You know, because it seems to me it's just the next job. You know, we have Iraq, and now we got Libya, and now we got Syria, and now we got to catch up here. We got to go after Ukraine now. I'm sorry, I don't want to be too glib here, but it's always an operation. You sit in a nice air-conditioned office in Washington, and then you do your dirty tricks, okay? They have no interest whatsoever about the people on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can go back to Afghanistan in the 1980s when the Mujahideen were our gallant heroes, and bin Laden was a freedom fighter. But, you know, let's go forward to Ukraine. What we're seeing is an approach led by the United States government to achieve a geostrategic objective. Let's just throw democracy and freedom out the window, because that's not what this is about. It's about pursuing a geostrategic objective of encircling Russia on its western borders. But you're right, it's done in a very reckless and in a very dangerous manner. It's short-term. They don't think about the consequences of their actions. And really, you know, that can just be described as arrogance. But, you know, as Vladimir and Patrick said, they cited Brzezinski and they cited the Heartland theory. But let's not also forget the Wolfowitz Doctrine, officially known as the Pentagon's Defense Planning Guidance of 1992. That is, I would argue, the blueprint for what we've seen in the last 20 years. The advance of NATO and the EU onto Russia's western borders, the construction of a missile defence shield in Eastern Europe, which is definitely aimed at Russia's strategic nuclear deterrent. The Wolfowitz Doctrine, after Paul Wolfowitz, clearly stated that Russia is the only country in the world capable of challenging American political dominance, and therefore steps need to be taken to reduce that, quote, threat, and that has to be done by bringing in those countries from the former Eastern Bloc and from the former Soviet Union, bring them into NATO, bring them into the EU, and therefore you will contain Russian power in Europe and thereby contain Russian power internationally. That's what it's all about in Ukraine.
Well, on that note, gentlemen, we've run out of time. In my opinion, we're seeing a lot of gross miscalculation. Many thanks to my guests in London and in Cleveland, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules. I love you.